Hey everyone, welcome back to the Crime Whisper today. We're diving into the dark underbelly of New Orleans, known for romance and beauty, but also hiding shadows of crime, mystery, and betrayal. This is New Orleans Crime Stories. New Orleans has always been a city of contradictions by day. Its streets are alive with brass bands, parades, and the intoxicating smell of Creole cuisine by night. Shadows creep into the alleyways of the French Quarter, where whispers of crime, corruption, and violence linger like cigarette smoke in the humid Louisiana air. It is a city built on beauty and brutality, where music and murder often coexist, just steps apart for centuries. New Orleans has captured the imagination of travelers, writers, and filmmakers, not just for its jazz and culture, but for its darker stories. The Crescent City has a long reputation for vice, gambling, brothels, smuggling, and violent crime have thrived here since the 18th century. The city's unique blend of cultures, Spanish, African, and Caribbean, created a melting pot of traditions, but also a fertile ground for crime syndicates, ritualistic legends, and unsolved mysteries. To understand New Orleans, one must accept both sides. The joyous parades, and the bloody the vibrant life and the chilling death. This is the story of crime in New Orleans, its most infamous criminals, haunting mysteries, and enduring legends. The French Quarters, Secrets. The French Quarter, or Vieux Carré, is the beating heart of New Orleans. Tourists know it for Bourbon Street bars and Mardi Gras beads. But beneath the neon lights lies a darker history. In the 1800s, the quarter was notorious for its brothels, gambling houses, and smuggling operations. The Mississippi River provided easy transport for goods, and contraband pirates like Jean Lafitte became folk heroes, celebrated for smuggling rum and goods while outwitting authorities. But Lafitte's charm belied the brutality of his men, who often left rivals dead in the swamps. As the century progressed, Storyville, the city's legalized red light district, became another hub of crime, while jazz legends like Jelly Roll Morton played in its saloons. Organized crime thrived in its shadows. Pimps, drug dealers, and violent gangsters controlled the flow of money, with politicians often turning a blind eye in exchange for bribes. Even today, the French Quarter holds remnants of those days. Old taverns where murders occurred, courtyards where duels ended in blood, and homes said to be haunted by victims of violent crimes. Axeman of New Orleans, 1918-1919. Few stories capture the terror of New Orleans crime history like the Axeman murders between 1918 and 1919. A mysterious killer stalked Italian grocers and their families, breaking into their homes at night and attacking them with an axe. The Axeman was never caught. His identity remains one of America's great unsolved mysteries. Victims described no robbery, no clear motive. The attacks seemed senseless, leaving entire communities paralyzed with fear. On March 13, 1919, the Axeman even taunted the city with a letter published in local newspapers. In it, he declared himself a demon from the hottest hell and promised to spare anyone who played jazz music in their homes on a certain night. That night, New Orleans erupted in jazz, every house, bar, and street corner filled with music. As terrified citizens obeyed the killer's strange demand, true to his word, no one was murdered that night. The killings continued sporadically afterward, then suddenly stopped. The Axeman vanished, leaving only legends behind. The case remains chilling, not just because of the brutality, but because it symbolizes the strange blend of music, superstition, and violence that defines New Orleans crime lore. The Mafia and Carlos Marcello's reign. While the Axeman faded into myth, another kind of criminal empire rose in New Orleans, the Mafia. By the early 20th century, Italian-American crime families had established themselves in the city. The most powerful of them all was led by Carlos Marcello, who controlled New Orleans from the 1940s through the 1980s. Marcello's influence was immense. He had politicians, police officers, and judges in his pocket. His empire stretched across Louisiana and beyond, profiting from gambling, narcotics, and extortion. Many historians believe Marcello played a role in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, though the evidence remains debated. Like flashy mob bosses in New York, Marcello kept a low profile. He preferred to work in the shadows, ensuring loyalty through fear. His reign turned New Orleans into one of America's most tightly controlled mafia territories. Of Marcello's ruthlessness still echo in the city. Informants disappeared, rivals turned up dead. Even after his imprisonment in the 1980s, the damage had been done. Organized crime had left its permanent mark on New Orleans voodoo rituals and urban legends. New Orleans crime stories are not only about gangsters and killers, they are also about the city's unique spiritual underworld. Voodoo, a religion brought by enslaved Africans and blended with Catholicism, became both a source of cultural pride and a backdrop for urban legends. Were sometimes blamed on voodoo curses, with sensationalist newspapers exaggerating the role of rituals and violent acts. One infamous legend is that of Madame Delphine, a wealthy socialite whose mansion hid horrific crimes. In 1834, a fire revealed that she had tortured enslaved people in her attic, sparking outrage and cementing her as one of New Orleans' most infamous villains. Other tales tell of grave robbing in St. Louis Cemetery, ritual killings, and haunted crime scenes. While some stories were likely exaggerated, they reinforced the image of New Orleans as a place where the supernatural and criminal overlapped. Modern crime waves. The 1980s, 2000 SBY, the late 20th century. New Orleans faced new forms of crime. The 1980s crack epidemic devastated poor neighborhoods, fueling gang violence and skyrocketing murder rates. In the 1990s, New Orleans often had the highest murder rate in the United States. Street gangs clashed over drug territories, leaving bodies in the streets. Innocent residents were caught in the crossfire, and entire communities lived under constant fear. Corruption also remained rampant. In 1994, police officer Len Davis was convicted for ordering the murder of a woman who filed a complaint against him. His case exposed deep corruption in the New Orleans Police Department, which at the time was considered one of the most corrupt in the nation. The city's struggle against violent crime became national news, and yet, amid the chaos, the culture of resilience continued. Jazz still played, Mardi Gras still thrived, and the people of New Orleans fought to survive Hurricane Katrina's shadow, looting, and violence. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, flooding neighborhoods and displacing thousands. The storm didn't just destroy buildings, it also unleashed a wave of crime as police forces collapsed under the chaos. Looting spread across the city. Armed gangs took control of certain neighborhoods. Some reports described shootouts in the Superdome, where evacuees had taken shelter. Others told of rescue helicopters being fired upon. While some stories were later exaggerated, there is no doubt that Katrina exposed the fragility of law and order in New Orleans. With no electricity, no communication, and thousands of desperate citizens, crime became a survival strategy for some and an opportunity for others. The scars of Katrina still remain not only in the rebuilt homes but in the memories of lawlessness and fear. Contemporary cases and ongoing struggles. Even today, New Orleans struggles with crime despite revitalization efforts. The city consistently ranks among the highest in the U.S. for homicide rates. Modern cases continue to shock the city. High-profile shootings in the French Quarter, gang-related murders, and corruption scandals involving police officers and politicians. Social inequality, poverty, and a lack of trust in the justice system fuel this cycle. Residents often describe a feeling that New Orleans is both magical and dangerous, a place where you can experience the best night of your life for the worst conclusion. The city of sin and survival. New Orleans crime stories are not just about killers, mobsters, and gangs. They are about a city that has always lived with duality, celebration and suffering, beauty and brutality, jazz and bloodshed. From the Axeman to the Mafia, from Katrina to modern-day shootings, Crime has been woven into the fabric of New Orleans, and yet, the city endures. Its people laugh, sing, dance, and rebuild. No matter how many times violence tries to silence them, New Orleans remains one of the most unique places in the world. A city where every street corner holds a story, some filled with joy, others drenched in crime. The Axeman's terror, in greater detail. The Axeman of New Orleans is one of the most frightening figures in American crime history, and his story deserves more detail. The first widely accepted attack occurred on May 23, 1918, when grocer Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were found brutally attacked in their home. Their throats were slit with a razor, and their heads smashed with an axe. The killer left the blood-soaked razor at the scene, along with a chilling message scrawled in chalk on a nearby wall. Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony. No one could make sense of it. The Axeman's pattern became horrifyingly consistent. He targeted mostly Italian grocers and their families, breaking into their homes by chiseling out a panel on the back door. Then he would strike with an axe, often one belonging to the victims themselves. The city spiraled into paranoia. Italian immigrants armed themselves, staying awake through the night, ready to shoot. At shadows, newspapers fanned the flames of hysteria, while police blundered through the investigation with little progress. One of the most bizarre twists was the infamous letter to the editor. Published in March 1919, the Axeman mocked the authorities and described himself as a supernatural being. "They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me. For I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell." He then gave his jazz ultimatum. "I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time." I just mentioned if everyone has a jazz band going. Well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night will get the axe on the appointed night. The city came alive with frantic music. Dance halls overflowed. Jazz bands played on street corners, and even poor families scraped together gramophones for one surreal evening. Fear turned into an impromptu festival, and, true to his word, the Axeman killed no one. But the terror resumed soon after. By October 1919, the killings stopped as abruptly as they began. Some believe the Axeman was killed, imprisoned on another charge, or simply left New Orleans. Others cling to the idea of something far stranger, a demon, a restless spirit, a supernatural force feeding on fear. The murders remain unsolved to this day. The Mafia and the killer Kingfish. Organized crime in New Orleans didn't start with Carlos Marcello, though he became the most powerful. Its roots stretch back to the late 19th century, when Italian immigrants arrived in large numbers. The Hennessy assassination of 1890 was one of the earliest Mafia-linked scandals. Police Chief David Hennessy was shot dead, allegedly by Sicilian gangsters. The murder trial ended in acquittals, but before the accused could be freed, a mob stormed the prison and lynched 11 Italian men. It was one of the largest mass lynchings in U.S. history and cemented the Mafia's reputation in New Orleans. Fast forward to the 1940s. Carlos Marcello rose to power, running operations from the French Quarter outward. His influence wasn't just local. Federal investigators linked him to drug trafficking networks, international gambling, and possibly even the assassination of President Kennedy. Marcello famously hated the Kennedys after Attorney General Robert Kennedy tried to deport him. Marcello allegedly vowed revenge. Some conspiracy theorists claim Marcello orchestrated JFK's assassination in 1963, using his connections with other mob bosses, while proof has never surfaced. The rumors remain a staple of Mafia lore. Like flamboyant New York mobsters, Marcello preferred the shadows. He ran his empire quietly, meeting in back rooms and bribing officials. One FBI agent called him the most dangerous man in America you've never heard of. Marcello ruled for decades before finally being imprisoned in the 1980s. His downfall didn't erase mafia influence entirely, but it marked the end of an era when one man controlled New Orleans crime with an iron grip. Storyville, sex, jazz, and violence. No history of New Orleans crime is complete without the city's infamous red light district, established in 1897. Storyville was meant to confine prostitution and vice to one neighborhood instead. It became a playground of crime, corruption, and exploitation. Brothels lined the streets. From luxurious mansions to filthy shacks, prostitutes, many underage, were forced into the trade. Often under violent pimps, drugs flowed freely, and gambling dens operated in the open. But Storyville also birthed jazz musicians like Jelly Roll Morton, Buddy Bolden, and a young Louis Armstrong played in saloons and brothels, inventing a sound that would conquer the world. The district was shut down in 1917, officially because of World War I concerns over soldiers visiting brothels. But the legacy of Storyville lingers, a neighborhood of beauty and degradation, where music and murder often played side by side. Police corruption. From Davis to Danziger, the New Orleans Police Department, NOPD, has long struggled with corruption. Few cases illustrate this more than Officer Len Davison, 1994. Davis ordered the murder of Kim Groves, a woman who had filed a brutality complaint against him. Davis, nicknamed RoboCop for his violent reputation, used drug dealers as his enforcers when Groves filed her complaint. Davis conspired with a dealer to have her killed. She was shot dead outside her home while FBI agents were actually monitoring Davis as part of an investigation. Davis was eventually sentenced to death, exposing just how deep corruption ran in the NOPD. Another dark stain came after Hurricane Katrina in the Danziger bridge shooting. Police officers opened fire on unarmed civilians crossing the bridge, killing 2 and wounding 4 others. The victims were simply trying to escape the floodwaters. Officers then tried to cover up the crime, planting weapons and falsifying reports. The scandal shocked the nation and revealed how fragile law enforcement could become in a city already crippled by disaster. Katrina's criminal chaos after Hurricane Katrina is often remembered for heartbreaking images of flooded homes and desperate survivors, but crime also flourished in the void. Looting broke out in the French Quarter, Canal Street, and local grocery stores. Some looted for survival food, water, diapers. Others took televisions and jewelry. Armed gangs roamed abandoned neighborhoods, sometimes carjacking vehicles carrying evacuees at the Superdome, where thousands had taken shelter. Rumors spread of rapes and murders. While some of these reports were later exaggerated, real incidents did occur. The psychological toll of being trapped in unbearable conditions with little security was immense. One chilling account describes National Guardsmen entering a flooded neighborhood, only to find armed residents patrolling their streets like militias. Unwilling to trust outsiders, law and order had collapsed, and survival instincts ruled. Katrina didn't just destroy New Orleans physically, it exposed the deep social wounds, poverty, inequality, and mistrust that continue to fuel crime today. Contemporary crime stories. Even in the 21st century, New Orleans struggles with violent crime. A few notable cases: the French Quarter shooting, 2016. 10 people were shot on Bourbon Street after an argument escalated. Tourists fled in terror, reminding the world that even the city's most famous street is not safe from violence. Turf wars. Local gangs like the 110ers and 39ers have been linked to dozens of homicides, often retaliatory shootings that spiral out of control. Carjackings. In recent years, carjacking has surged, with brazen attacks happening in daylight, sometimes involving teenage perpetrators. Despite these stories, many locals point out that crime in New Orleans is often concentrated in certain neighborhoods and tied to systemic issues like poverty and lack of opportunity. The psychology of New Orleans crime. New Orleans crime is different from other cities because it's inseparable from the city's identity. Crime here becomes legend, part of the storytelling culture, The Axeman isn't just a serial killer. He's a ghost story, whispered during jazz sets. Carlos Marcello isn't just a mobster. He's a shadow figure in conspiracy theories about presidents. Madame Lalaurie isn't just a cruel socialite. She's a haunting presence on ghost tours even. Modern crimes get woven into folklore. The Danziger Bridge tragedy, Katrina looting, French Quarter shootings, each becomes part of the city's mythos. This blending of crime and culture makes New Orleans both fascinating and terrifying. It's not just crime, it's storytelling through blood. Conclusion: the endless dance of light and darkness, from the Axeman's jazz ultimatum to the Mafia's iron grip. From the chaos of Katrina to modern gang warfare, New Orleans crime stories span centuries of violence and resilience. And yet, the city survives, jazz still fills the streets, Mardi Gras parades still roll, families still rebuild after every tragedy. New Orleans is not just a city of crime, it's a city of survival. Every crime story is countered by a story of resilience. Every act of violence is answered with music, laughter, and parades. Perhaps that is the ultimate crime story of New Orleans. Not just the blood spilled, but the spirit that refuses to die. New Orleans is a city where not every crime finds closure. Many cases fade into legend, with unanswered questions keeping the public captivated. One such case is the murder of Addie Hall and Zach Bowen. In 2006, their story began as a post-Katrina love affair. Bowen, a bartender, and Hall, a free-spirited dancer, stayed behind in the French Quarter during the hurricane, surviving without electricity while drinking by candlelight and cooking on campfires. They became something of local celebrities, but their romance spiraled into darkness. In October 2006, police found Bowen's body after he jumped from the Omni Hotel. In his pocket was a note leading authorities to his apartment. What they discovered shocked even hardened detectives. Hall's dismembered body was inside, with parts cooked on the stove. The case was labeled a murder, but questions remain. Was Bowen driven mad by PTSD from his military service in Iraq? Did Katrina's chaos scar him beyond repair? Or was it something darker within New Orleans itself that consumed him? This case joined the city's long list of stories where tragedy and horror collide in surreal, unforgettable ways. Crimes of passion in the French Quarter. The French Quarter is famous for romance and revelry, but passion often turns violent. In the 1970s, the Quarter Queen murder shocked locals. Several women working as dancers and sex workers in Bourbon Street clubs were found murdered, their bodies dumped in alleys or the river. Though police suspected serial offenders targeting vulnerable women, many of the cases were never solved. Part of the problem was corruption. Officers on the take from brothels and clubs looked the other way, allowing predators to thrive. In some cases, suspects were tied to local organized crime, which discouraged further investigation. The message was chilling. In New Orleans, certain lives were considered disposable. The voodoo murders and occult crimes. While most voodoo crimes are exaggerations or tourist myths, there have been genuine cases where ritualistic elements were part of murders. In 1987, police discovered a body in the Treem neighborhood surrounded by candles, feathers, and symbols that suggested voodoo rituals, though the killing was ultimately linked to personal disputes rather than religion. Newspapers sensationalized it as a voodoo murder. This wasn't an isolated case. Over the decades, several violent crimes were attributed, fairly or not, to voodoo practices. Often, it was simply a way to stigmatize African American or Caribbean traditions. But in the public imagination, New Orleans became a place where crime and the supernatural danced together. Even today, ghost tours and voodoo shops in the Quarter profit from this reputation, blending fact and myth into a potent narrative. The rise of drug lords and street kings. By the 1980s and 1990s, organized crime in New Orleans shifted from mafia bosses to local drug lords. Crack cocaine devastated neighborhoods, and young men formed gangs that ruled with violence. Of the most feared groups was the Dooney Boys, who controlled parts of the Ninth Ward. Their wars with rival gangs left countless bodies in the streets. Police struggled to contain the violence, as corruption within the department often meant that drug dealers were tipped off about raids in the 1990s. New Orleans reached the grim milestone of being America's murder capital, with over 400 murders in 1994 alone. The city became a war zone. Victims were often young, poor, and black lives cut short by cycles of poverty and vengeance. Global fascination with New Orleans crime. Why do New Orleans crime stories resonate far beyond the city? Part of it is the setting, the gaslit streets of the quarter, the jazz clubs, the cemeteries all provide an atmosphere perfect for storytelling. A murder in New Orleans feels different than a murder in any other American city. Part of it is the myth-making culture. New Orleanians tell stories like no one else. Even the worst crimes become folklore, retold with a blend of fear and dark humor. And part of it is the duality of beauty and horror. A jazz parade may pass by a crime scene. A wedding may unfold in a neighborhood haunted by gang violence. The juxtaposition is startling. Unforgettable reflections. Crime and resilience. New Orleans crime stories are not just about violence. They are about survival. Every era brought a new wave of criminals. The pirates, the axemen, the mafia. The gangs in every era brought resilience. The musicians, the families. The culture that refuses to die. If crime is the shadow of New Orleans, music is its light, and the two will always coexist. New Orleans is not defined only by crime, but crime is undeniably a part of its character. From the Axemen's jazz ultimatum to Katrina's chaos, from mafia conspiracies to modern-day shootings, each story is a thread in the larger tapestry of a city that is equal parts beautiful and brutal. The lesson is this: New Orleans is a city that refuses to be defeated. Its crime stories are chilling, yes, but they are also reminders of how much the city has endured, how much it still has to give. Duels, honor, and blood in the 1800s, long before the mafia or street gangs. Crime in New Orleans often took the form of duels of honor in the 1800s. The city was known as the dueling capital of America. At Duelists' Oak in City Park, men fought with pistols, swords, or sabers over insults, debts, or romantic disputes. Lawyers, politicians, and even journalists faced off. Sometimes fatally. The duels were technically illegal, but police rarely interfered. One notorious duel involved Bernard de Marigny, a wealthy landowner who popularized the game of craps. Known for his fiery temper, de Marigny fought several duels, leaving at least one opponent dead while dueling faded by the late 19th century. Its spirit lived on in the city's culture of violent disputes, where in other cities insults might end in fit. In New Orleans they could end in blood spilled under oak trees at dawn. Great heists of the Crescent City, though murders dominate. New Orleans crime history. The city has also seen its share of daring robberies. 1975. The Canal Street armored car heist made headlines when thieves ambushed a Brinks truck in broad daylight, escaping with nearly $1 million. The robbery shocked the city not only for its scale, but for its boldness. It happened just blocks from the French Quarter. Another infamous case was the Whitney bank robbery of 1996, where inside help allowed criminals to access vaults. Millions vanished, though only part of the money was ever recovered. Some locals joke that pieces of that heist are still hidden in the swamps. These crimes showed another side of New Orleans' criminal world, not just violent, but cunning and calculated. Haunted crimes, where ghosts walk beside the living. New Orleans is a city of ghosts, and many of its most violent crimes are said to echo through haunted locations. The Lalaurie Mansion, site of Madame Delphine Lalauer's torture chamber, is infamous for screams said to echo from its walls. Tourists claim to see shadowy figures in the windows. Though the house has been privately owned for years, the Hotel Monteleone, a landmark in the French Quarter, is said to be haunted by victims of 19th century murders. Staff and guests report cold spots, flickering lights, and spectral children playing in the hallways. The old Absinthe House bar, where mobsters and smugglers once plotted, allegedly still hosts ghostly arguments at night. These stories blur the line between crime and folklore, reminding us that in New Orleans, murder rarely stays buried, becomes part of the atmosphere, the criminal future of New Orleans as of the 2020s. New Orleans continues to wrestle with crime. The homicide rate remains among the highest in the United States, fueled by gang rivalries and poverty. But technology is changing the game. Police now use surveillance cameras, license plate readers, and predictive policing software criminals to adapt to using encrypted phones, social media, and even cryptocurrency to run their operations. Experts warn that unless systemic issues like poverty, education, and trust in law enforcement are addressed, crime will remain woven into New Orleans' fabric still. Locals remain resilient. Community programs, youth mentorship, and grassroots organizations fight daily to break the cycle. The city may always have crime, but it will also always have resistance. When you walk through the French Quarter at night, you feel it, the blend of music, mystery, and menace. Jazz drifts from open doors, but so do whispers of unsolved murders, cemeteries, guard secrets of duels, mafia hits, and storm-born tragedies. New Orleans is not just a city with crime, it is a city defined by the stories crime leaves behind, stories of fear, corruption, survival, and resilience. It is a place where the line between history and legend blurs, where the Axeman's Jazz Ultimatum feels as real as yesterday's shooting, where ghosts of the past walk alongside the criminals of the present, and perhaps that's the final truth of New Orleans crime stories. They never end. They simply change masks, like revelers at Mardi Gras, playing new roles in the endless drama of the Crescent City, long before the mafia, long before gangs ruled the streets. New Orleans was a pirate city. The Mississippi River made the city a perfect hub for contraband. Smugglers brought in rum, tobacco, weapons, and enslaved people, often bribing customs officials to look the other way. The heart of this underworld was Jean Lafitte, the legendary pirate of the Gulf, operating out of Barataria Bay. Lafitte and his men smuggled goods into New Orleans, selling them openly at markets. He became a folk hero, charming locals with his generosity while terrifying rivals. But Lafitte was also ruthless. Rivals were killed, betrayed, or left stranded at sea. His operations thrived on corruption. City officials happily pocketed bribes while pretending to enforce the law. When the War of 1812 erupted, Lafitte struck a deal with General Andrew Jackson, helping defend New Orleans against the British in exchange for a pardon. The pirate who once robbed ships now became a war hero. This episode cemented the city's reputation, a place where crime and politics, vice and patriotism often walked hand in hand. Prohibition. The booze never stopped flowing when Prohibition hit in 1920, outlawing alcohol nationwide. New Orleans barely flinched. The city had always embraced drinking, and its speakeasies flourished. Bootleggers smuggled liquor through the Gulf Coast, while jazz clubs served cocktails in teacups to disguise them from police. Unlike in other cities, enforcement was lax. Many police officers and politicians were already on the take as long as bribes flowed. The booze flowed too. Prohibition also fueled the rise of the mafia in New Orleans. Control of liquor distribution became a major racket, with violence erupting between rival bootleggers. Shootings and bombings occasionally rocked the French Quarter as gangs fought for dominance. Yet, for ordinary citizens, Prohibition often felt like a joke in New Orleans. You could always find a drink. It just meant slipping into the right back room or asking the right bartender. Civil rights era crimes. The 1950s and 1960s brought not only social upheaval, but also racially charged crimes in New Orleans. During school desegregation in 1960, young African American students like Ruby Bridges faced threats of violence as they entered formerly all-white schools, while not always classified as crime stories. The intimidation, riots, and mob actions were indeed crimes. Hate crimes that scarred the city's civil rights activists faced harassment from police and white supremacist groups. Beatings, firebombing, and arrests were common tactics used to suppress change. These struggles revealed another layer of New Orleans crime, not just organized gangs or killers, but systemic violence rooted in racism and oppression. Tourist crimes. Mardi Gras and the dark carnival. Mardi Gras is New Orleans' most famous celebration. Parades, costumes, and music flooding the streets, but the festival has always attracted crime. Alongside revelry, pickpockets thrive in the packed crowds, slipping wallets and purses while police are overwhelmed. Drunken fights often spill out of bars into the streets. Some years, shootings erupt during parades, turning moments of joy into scenes of chaos. One particularly grim case occurred in 2004, when a tourist was shot dead just off Bourbon Street during Mardi Gras. Despite thousands of witnesses, the suspect melted into the crowd, and the case dragged on for years for locals. This duality is expected. Mardi Gras is magic, but it's also dangerous. Crime hides in the costumes, ready to strike when the music is loudest. New Orleans on screen. Crime as cinema. Part of why New Orleans crime fascinates is because it feels cinematic. Hollywood has long used the city as a backdrop for crime dramas. The Big Easy One, 986, showed a romanticized yet corrupt police force. Runaway Jury, 2003, explored corruption in the justice system. Countless documentaries and ghost shows focus on the Axemen, the Mafia, and Katrina crimes, but the truth is even stranger than fiction. Where else but New Orleans would a serial killer demand jazz music as tribute? Where else would a pirate become both outlaw and hero? Where else would corruption, murder, and voodoo intertwine so naturally that they feel like folklore? Every crime in New Orleans could be a movie scene, and in many ways, the city itself is a film that never ends, projected in blood, brass, and shadows. Crime in New Orleans is not a footnote, it is a chapter written into the city's DNA, from pirates to gangsters, from duels to modern shootings. Every generation has its stories. Some are solved, many are not, but unlike other cities, New Orleans never forgets. Its people turn crime into story, story into legend, and legend into identity. When the parades roll down St. Charles Avenue, or when jazz echoes down Bourbon Street, the city is celebrating not just life, but survival. Survival through storms, through corruption, through crime. New Orleans crime stories are endless. They are not just tales of blood, they are tales of resilience, and as long as the city stands, so too will its shadows. The great bank heists of New Orleans. New Orleans was never just about gangsters and murderers. It also had its fair share of heists and daring robberies. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, banks along Canal Street and St. Charles Avenue became targets of bold bandits. One famous case occurred in 1907, when 3 masked men stormed the Canal Commercial Bank in broad daylight, armed with revolvers. They ordered everyone to the floor and filled sacks with thousands in cash. Robbers escaped on horseback through the French Quarter's tight streets, vanishing before police could respond, despite a massive manhunt. The gang was never caught. Newspapers dubbed it the Great Canal Street Heist. Later, in the 1970s, a wave of armed robberies swept the city, with drug-fueled gangs hitting corner stores, gas stations, and even armored car shootouts with police were frequent. Each heist seemed to feed the legend that New Orleans, with its winding streets and shadowy alleys, was the perfect place for a criminal to disappear. Police, corruption, the crooked shield. If you ask locals why crime has thrived in New Orleans, many will tell you, because the police were often part of it, from the 1800s onward. New Orleans Police Department (NOPD) had a reputation for corruption. Bribes from gamblers, bootleggers, and mafia bosses often determined who was arrested and who walked free. In the 1990s, the scandal reached national attention with cases like Len Davis. An NOPD officer nicknamed RoboCop. Davis wasn't just corrupt, He was lethal in 1994. He ordered the murder of a woman, Kim Groves, who had filed a brutality complaint against him. He was later convicted and sentenced to death. Stories like these reinforced a bitter truth. In New Orleans, sometimes the criminals wore uniforms. Katrina. When the law collapsed when Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005, crime entered a lawless chapter with the city flooded, police stations abandoned, and communications down. Order collapsed, looting erupted in stores and malls. Some residents broke into grocery shops simply to survive, but others looted electronics, jewelry, and weapons. Armed gangs roamed neighborhoods, and reports of shootings, carjackings, and assaults filled the airwaves. Hospitals were raided, tourists trapped in hotels begged for rescue. The Superdome, meant to be a shelter, turned into a nightmare packed with thousands of desperate people. It descended into violence, with assaults and robberies reported in the dark hallways for weeks. The city felt like a post-apocalyptic movie. The National Guard had to patrol streets with rifles just to restore some order. Katrina revealed the fragility of law in New Orleans when disaster hit. Crime thrived. The modern gang wars. By the 2010s, New Orleans faced another plague: gang violence fueled by drugs and poverty. Small neighborhood crews like the 110ers, the Ride or Die Gang, and others battled over corners, and drug turf shootings often erupted in broad daylight, sometimes during family events or parades. In 2012, during a Mother's Day parade, gunmen opened fire into a crowd, wounding 20 people. The attack shocked even hardened locals. Police crackdowns arrested dozens. But for every gang taken down, another seemed to rise. The cycle of poverty, corruption, and violence kept fueling the city's murder rate, which consistently ranked among the highest in America. For residents, it became part of daily life, avoiding certain blocks after dark, teaching children to duck when shots rang out, and living with the reality that joy and danger always walked hand in hand. In New Orleans, haunted crimes, ghosts of violence. New Orleans is not only the most haunted city in America, it's haunted because of its crimes. The Lalaurie Mansion. In the 1830s, socialite Madame Delphine Lalaurie was exposed for torturing enslaved people in her mansion. When her crimes were discovered, an angry mob stormed her home, but she escaped to France. Today, the mansion is considered one of the most haunted places in America, with visitors claiming to hear screams of the tortured Pirates Alley. Legend says Jean Lafette himself haunts the narrow alley behind St. Louis Cathedral, guarding his smuggled treasure. The Axeman of New Orleans. Some locals insist his ghost lingers, especially near the old neighborhoods where he struck musicians. Even joke that every time jazz echoes late at night, it's because the Axeman demanded it. In New Orleans, the line between crime and ghost story blurs. Every violent act leaves an echo, and the city's residents have always been good at turning echoes into legend. Reflections. Why New Orleans breeds legends of crime? Why does New Orleans produce such unforgettable crime stories? Its geography: a port city, open to smuggling, piracy, and escape. Its corruption. Politics and crime often work together instead of against each other. Its culture: jazz, voodoo, parades. Everything in New Orleans becomes a story, a myth. Crime here isn't just crime, it's theater, it's resilience. Even in tragedy, the people of New Orleans keep telling their stories, turning pain into folklore. From duels under the oaks of City Park, to mafia bosses and smoke-filled bars, to ghostly screams in the French Quarter, the city has never separated life from crime. Instead, it absorbs it, retells it, and keeps it alive. New Orleans crime is not just about violence, it's about identity. The city wears its scars proudly, like tattoos, proof of a survival unmatched in America. The story of Zach Bowen and Addie Hall is one of New Orleans' most disturbing modern crimes, combining post-Katrina trauma, love gone wrong, and a descent into madness. Zach and Addie were two French Quarter bohemians when Katrina hit in 2005. Instead of evacuating, they stayed behind, turning their bar apartment into a post-apocalyptic hideout. They became local celebrities, drinking by candlelight, cooking on campfires, and even dancing naked in the streets. But once the city reopened and life returned, their relationship soured. Zach, an Iraq war veteran, carried deep trauma. Addie was fiery, volatile, and often violent. Neighbors described their fights as explosive. In October 2006, police responding to a disturbance at a French Quarter apartment found a horrific scene. Addie's body dismembered, with her head in a pot on the stove and limbs in the oven. Suicide note led police to the Omni Hotel, where Zach had jumped to his death from the rooftop. In the note, he admitted to killing Addie after a violent fight. The case shocked the nation, not just for the gruesome details, but because it seemed to symbolize the madness Katrina had unleashed. New Orleans, broken by flood and trauma, had given birth to one of its darkest love stories, the Brinks truck robbery. 1980. On a humid morning in 1980, a Brinks armored truck rolled through New Orleans, carrying millions in cash. It never made it to its destination. Masked gunmen ambushed the truck in a carefully planned heist, overwhelming the guards with automatic weapons in minutes. They vanished with more than $600,000 in cash. A fortune. At the time the robbery shocked the city, with newspapers calling it the biggest score since the pirate days. Federal investigators descended on New Orleans, suspecting local mafia ties. Eventually, some of the robbers were caught, but much of the money was never recovered for years. Rumors spread that it was hidden in French Quarter safe houses or buried along the Bight. Brinks' job added to New Orleans' legend as a city where big crimes weren't just committed, they were staged like theater. The French Quarter's 1990s saw a terrifying serial killer stalk New Orleans, the so-called French Quarter, strangler targeting gay men and trans women. The killer lured victims from bars along Bourbon Street and strangled them, leaving bodies in hotels and back alleys for years. Fear gripped the LGBTQ+ community. As police seemed slow to act, many accused the NOPD of indifference, since the victims were marked. In 1999, police arrested Daniel Blank, a drifter who confessed to multiple killings across Louisiana, including several in New Orleans, though not all murders were conclusively tied to him. The case highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized groups in the city, and how predators exploited both nightlife and systemic neglect. The brothel wars of Canal Street. In the late 1800s, prostitution flourished in New Orleans, especially in the red light district, but the vice economy also fueled violent turf wars. Brothel owners along Canal Street and Basin Street bribed police, fought in court, and sometimes resorted to gunfights to protect their businesses. Rival madams slashed each other's girls, torched buildings, and used hired thugs to intimidate competitors. One notorious figure was Josie Arlington, the Madam Queen of Storyville, known for both elegance and ruthlessness. Josie ran one of the most exclusive brothels, catering to the rich and powerful, but she also waged bitter feuds with rival madams, sometimes ending in bloodshed. The brothel wars shaped the city's underworld, proving again that in New Orleans, crime was never just about money. It was about reputation, pride, and survival. Antoinette Frank, the killer cop. Perhaps no modern case damaged the NOPD's reputation more than Antoinette Frank, hired in the early 1990s. Frank was one of the few women on the force at first. She was praised for breaking barriers, but soon, rumors swirled. She was unstable, manipulative, and had ties to criminals. On March 4, 1995, Frank committed a crime that horrified the city. She and her teenage accomplice, Rogers Lakazi, entered the Kim Na Vietnamese restaurant in New Orleans, East, a place Frank had frequented armed and masked. They robbed the restaurant, then executed 3 people: restaurant owner, Havu, her husband, and their young daughter. 2 others were shot but survived. What shocked the city most was that a police officer sworn to protect had coldly murdered innocent people. She knew. Frank was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. where she remains on death row. The case reinforced the deep mistrust many had toward the NOPD, painting it not just as corrupt, but as capable of producing killers in uniform. The endless web from pirates to mafia dons, from voodoo murders to police killers. New Orleans crime history is not a single story, it's a web. Each case, each scandal, each legend connects to the others. The city does not bury its crimes, it tells them, retells them, and lets them live on in barroom stories, ghost tours, and novels. Crime here is not just a scar, it is part of the city's face. Carlos Marcello, the godfather of New Orleans. No history of crime in New Orleans is complete without Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss who ruled the city for decades. Born in Sicily and raised in Louisiana, Marcello rose from petty hustler to head of the New Orleans crime family in the 1940s. Unlike flashy mobsters in New York or Chicago, Marcello kept a low profile, running his empire from behind tomato trucks and real estate fronts. But his power was immense. He controlled gambling, prostitution, drug smuggling, and political corruption across Louisiana. Politicians, judges, and police officers often danced to his tune. Marcello's most infamous connection, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Some researchers believe Marcello, bitter after being deported at Kennedy's orders, may have conspired with other mob bosses to arrange the killing, though never proven. The whisper cemented his legend. Marcello was eventually convicted on racketeering charges in the 1980s, but by then, his grip on the city had already shaped decades of crime in New Orleans. His name still carries a dark weight. The quiet Don, who turned the Crescent City into his private kingdom. Joseph Perret, murder for hire. In the Big Easy in the 1970s, New Orleans police uncovered a chilling scheme. A murder for hire ring, led by Joseph Perret, a hitman who turned assassination into business. Perret and his crew specialized in contract killings, often tied to drug debts or gang disputes. For a price, they'd ambush rivals, often leaving bodies in cars dumped along the bayou. What shocked investigators most was how casually the killings were ordered, sometimes over drinks in French Quarter bars. Life in the city was so cheap that Perret's services became an open secret. Eventually, federal agents infiltrated the ring. Perret was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life. But by then, the damage was done. His killings added to the sense that New Orleans was a place where violence could be bought like a round of whiskey. The Desire Housing Project wars. Desire projects in New Orleans were once among the largest public housing developments in the U.S., and by the 1980s and 1990s, they had become a battleground. Crack cocaine flooded the projects, bringing violent gangs that fought over control. Shootings became nightly events. Residents described walking children past gunfire or sleeping in bathtubs to avoid stray bullets. Police raids often turned into shootouts. In one infamous 1970s standoff, Black Panther members occupying the Desire projects exchanged gunfire with heavily armed police, though miraculously no one was killed. It highlighted how militarized the struggle for control had become. By the 2000s, the projects were demolished, but their legacy lingered, a symbol of how poverty, drugs, and neglect turned parts of New Orleans into war zones. The Canal Street Shootout. 1970s Canal Street, the commercial heart of New Orleans, was the site of one of the bloodiest shootouts in the city's modern history in the early 1970s. Police tried to arrest a group of armed robbers who had been targeting downtown stores, but instead of surrendering, the criminals opened fire with automatic weapons in broad daylight. Chaos erupted. Shoppers ducked for cover as bullets tore through windows. Police cars riddled with gunfire blocked the street. By the time it was over, multiple officers and suspects were dead, and the event was burned into memory. As the day downtown turned into a battlefield, the shootout reinforced the city's reputation. Even its busiest tourist streets could suddenly turn into scenes of war. The Jazzland theme park killings after Hurricane Katrina. The abandoned Six Flags Jazzland theme park became one of the eeriest places in New Orleans. Flooded, rusting, and overtaken by weeds, it drew explorers, Vandals and Criminals in 2007. The park became the site of a grisly crime when the bodies of two teenagers were found in one of the ruined buildings. Police suspected gang retaliation, using the abandoned park as a dumping ground. The killings turned Jazzland into more than an urban exploration site. It became a symbol of post-Katrina decay, where crime thrived in the city's ruins. Even today, ghost hunters and thrill seekers whisper about the murders as they wander the skeletal remains of roller coasters' web of shadows. Each of these stories, from Marcello's Mafia to Jazzland murders, adds another thread to New Orleans' crime tapestry. The city is not defined by one era or one type of crime. It is a layered stage, where every decade brings new villains, new victims, and new legends. Clementine Barnabette, the voodoo murderess in the early 1900s. New Orleans and the surrounding Louisiana towns were terrorized by a string of axe murders. Families were slaughtered in their beds, men, women, and children hacked to death with almost ritualistic brutality. Suspicion fell on Clementine Barnabette, a young Creole woman from a deeply troubled family in Opal, north of New Orleans. Arrested in 1911, Clementine shocked authorities by confessing to over 30 murders. She claimed she was part of a voodoo cult known as the Church of Sacrifice, which demanded human blood offerings. Whether the cult truly existed or was a delusion remains debated. But Clementine's detailed confessions chilled the public, though later recanting parts of her story. She was convicted and sentenced to life. She was released after serving just over a decade. Disappearing into history, the voodoo murderess remains one of Louisiana's most bizarre cases, an unsettling blend of superstition, brutality, and mystery that still haunts New Orleans folklore. The Brigham Street Massacre. The 1960s brought one of New Orleans' bloodiest crimes. The Brigham Street Massacre in 1965. Police discovered the bodies of an entire family murdered in their home on Brigham Street. Parents and children alike had been shot execution style. The motive: robbery and debt. Investigators tied the killings to a local gang attempting to send a message. But what horrified the city was not just the violence, was the targeting of innocent children. The massacre made headlines nationwide, reinforcing the image of New Orleans as a city where brutality could erupt in even the quietest neighborhoods. The downtown sniper of 1973, one of the darkest days in New Orleans. History came on January 7, 1973, when a gunman opened fire from the 16th floor of the downtown Howard Johnson Hotel. Today, the Holiday Inn. The shooter, Mark Essex, a 23-year-old Navy deserter, had previously attacked a police station, killing an officer. Now armed with a rifle, he unleashed terror on Canal Street for hours. Essex fired at police and civilians below, killing 9 people, including hotel guests and police officers. The standoff ended only when a police helicopter strafed the rooftop with gunfire. Killing Essex, the Howard Johnson sniper left a scar on the city, remembered as one of the deadliest mass shootings in New Orleans. History: corruption in the sheriff's office. While the NOPD was notorious for corruption, the Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office was no better. In the 1980s and 1990s, scandals erupted over bribery, misuse of funds, and the shocking conditions of the Orleans Parish Prison, where inmates often ran operations from inside. Drugs, weapons, and even cell phones flowed freely in and out of the jail. Several sheriffs were accused of running the jail as a personal empire, with political patronage, bribes, and backroom deals shaping the institution. The corruption weakened public faith in justice for many locals. Being arrested in New Orleans didn't mean justice would follow. It meant you were stepping into another layer of the city's criminal web. Melvin Henry, the French Quarter killer. In the 1980s, a series of murders in the French Quarter baffled police. Tourists and locals alike were strangled or beaten, their bodies dumped in alleys or hotel rooms. Eventually, investigators zeroed in on Melvin Henry, a drifter who preyed on the vulnerable. Henry admitted to multiple killings, often targeting women and gay men he lured from bars. His capture didn't just close a case, It exposed how dangerous the quarter could be for visitors behind the jazz, neon, and laughter. Predators like Henry prowled to this day. Ghost tours in the quarter recount his crimes, weaving them into the haunted tapestry of the city. Endless darkness. Endless story from voodoo cult killers to rooftop snipers. New Orleans has seen crimes that feel larger than life. They're not just tragedies, they're stories. Soaked into the bricks of the French Quarter and whispered in the bars of Bourbon Street and still. The city lives for every horror. There's resilience for every killer. A jazz funeral that drowns grief in music. That is New Orleans' paradox. A city of crime, yes, but also a city of survival. Mafia blood in the French Quarter. By the mid-20th century, New Orleans had become a stronghold for organized crime, while cities like Chicago had Al Capone and New York had the Five Families. New Orleans had Carlos Marcello. Marcello was the undisputed mafia boss of the city from the 1940s through the 1980s. Short, stocky, and ruthless, he ruled from his headquarters at the Town and Country Motel, just outside the city. Marcello's power extended beyond the French Quarter's illegal casinos, strip clubs, and heroin pipelines. He controlled judges, police, and politicians. Testimony later revealed that he bribed officials at every level of Louisiana government. And then came the whispers, after President John F. Kennedy declared war on organized crime and had Marcello deported to Guatemala. The mobster seethed with rage. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and conspiracy theorists still point to Marcello as one of the key suspects who may have orchestrated the killing. True or not, Marcello's legend looms large. For decades, bodies tied to mafia disputes turned up in the bayous, canals, and back alleys of New Orleans. Silent testimony to the cost of crossing the mob. The canal murders in the 1970s and 1980s. A series of grisly discoveries shocked residents living near the industrial canal. Bodies often bound, beaten, or shot were pulled from the water. The killings were tied to drug disputes, mafia enforcers, and sometimes domestic feuds gone fatally wrong. Police records from the era are full of cases where the canal became a dumping ground for those who had displeased the wrong people. For locals, the canal became a whispered landmark, a place where debts were paid in blood. The Desire housing projects, a city within a city of. You wanted to see the raw face of New Orleans crime in the 1970s and 80s. You didn't look at the French Quarter, you went to the Desire housing projects at its peak. Desire was one of the largest public housing complexes in the United States, but what was meant to be affordable housing soon decayed into a warren of poverty, gangs, and drugs. Police officers often refused to patrol Desire without backup. Residents told stories of gunfights erupting in broad daylight, dealers openly running business, and teenagers carrying more firepower than the authorities. One of the most infamous moments came when members of the Black Panther Party briefly occupied Desire in 1970, turning the project into a fortified base. The standoff with police ended without mass bloodshed, but it showed just how lawless the neighborhood had become for decades. Desire was shorthand for chaos in New Orleans. Its demolition in the 1990s closed a chapter, but the memory of those years still lingers. The hit on Fat Tony Tricarion, a mafia underboss known as Anthony Fat Tony. Tricario was gunned down in his car on a quiet New Orleans street. His assassination shocked the Italian-American community, as Tony had been a visible figure in local politics and business. But Fat Tony had crossed Marcello's organization. He was accused of skimming money from French Quarter clubs and trying to start his own independent racket. His death was a textbook mob hit, sudden, clean, and unsolved. Witnesses were scarce, and no one dared to testify. Served as a reminder that, in New Orleans, the mafia's grip remained ironclad well into the 1980s. The crack epidemic and the 1990s bloodbath. 1990s marked one of the bloodiest decades in New Orleans history. Crack cocaine flooded the streets. Gangs battled for turf, and the murder rates skyrocketed. Entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Kids barely out of middle school were recruited as lookouts, and gunmen shootings on Claiborne Avenue and in Treme were so frequent that locals described them as a war zone by the mid-90s. New Orleans had one of the highest homicide rates in America, 400 murders. A year in a city of just under 500,000 police were overwhelmed, and corruption made it worse. Many officers were caught taking bribes, stealing drugs, or even moonlighting as hitmen. For dealers, one chilling case involved an NOPD officer who murdered her own partner during a robbery gone wrong. The scandal confirmed what many already believed. In the New Orleans of the 90s, the line between criminal and cop was razor thin. Mardi Gras stabbings. While Mardi Gras is known for beads, music, and parades, it has also been marked by shocking acts of violence. In 2009, during the height of carnival season, multiple stabbings broke out on Bourbon Street. Video captured chaotic scenes of tourists and locals scattering as knives flashed in the crowd. Police struggled to contain the violence, but the truth is, Mardi Gras has always been dangerous. Beneath the glitter, assaults, robberies, and murders often spike during the season, when drunken crowds make easy targets for every tourist leaving with happy memories. Another leaves scarred or doesn't leave at all. Ghosts of the French Quarter. Beyond the documented murders and mafia hits, New Orleans thrives on stories of crime that blur the line between reality and legend. The Lalaurie Mansion, where enslaved people were allegedly tortured and killed in the 1830s, is still called one of the most haunted houses in America. The legend of the Casket Girls at the Ursuline Convent tells of mysterious women who arrived in New Orleans with coffin-shaped chests, sparking rumors of vampirism. And in the French Quarter's narrow alleys, ghost tours recount tales of phantom killers, vanished bodies, and spirits of murder victims who refuse to rest. For many, the supernatural isn't separate from crime, it's another layer of the city's long, bloody history. Hurricane Katrina and the collapse of Ordwin. Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans in August 2005. It wasn't just homes and levees that were destroyed. The city's justice system collapsed overnight. Stations were flooded, prisons overflowed with inmates who had to be hastily evacuated. Courts shut down indefinitely, and in the vacuum, chaos reigned. Looting spread across the French Quarter and uptown. Gunfire echoed in the flooded neighborhoods of the lower Ninth Ward. Armed gangs roamed abandoned streets, taking over stores and homes. Rumors swirled of snipers shooting at rescue helicopters, though some reports were later disputed. Still, the truth was undeniable. For days, New Orleans was a lawless city, where survival meant looking out for yourself. The world watched in horror. For many, Katrina revealed not just the failure of the levees, but the fragility of law and order in America's most haunted city. The Danziger Bridge Massacre, perhaps the darkest moment of the Katrina aftermath, came on September 4, 2005, when New Orleans police officers opened fire on unarmed civilians crossing the Danziger Bridge. 2 people were killed, 4 others wounded. The victims had been looking for food and safety, not causing trouble yet. Officers claimed they had been shot at first, a story later proven false. Years of investigations followed. Eventually, several NOPD officers were convicted of civil rights violations. Though legal battles dragged on for over a decade, the Danziger Bridge Massacre became a symbol of police corruption, brutality, and cover-ups in New Orleans, scars that the city still struggles to heal post-Katrina. Gang wars. As the city tried to rebuild, a new crime wave erupted, with police forces weakened and neighborhoods shattered. Gangs stepped into the power vacuum in areas like Central City, Holly Grove, and the 7th Ward. Young men formed cliques armed with assault rifles, fighting over corners and drug turf. One of the most infamous crews was the 39ers Gang, a ruthless alliance that left dozens dead in turf wars. Their rivals, the Young Melf Mafia, controlled parts of Central City with equal violence. By the late 2000s, New Orleans once again topped national homicide charts, often recording 10 times the national murder average. For many locals, post-Katrina New Orleans felt like 2 cities, one rebuilding with hope and tourism, the other drowning in gunfire and grief. The murder of General Shivers among the many post-Katrina killings. One stood out for its cruelty in 2006. General Shivers, a beloved teacher, jazz musician, and drummer for the Hot 8 brass band, was gunned down in his car. He had been targeted by mistake. Killers had actually been looking for his stepson. Death shocked the community. He wasn't a gangster or drug dealer. He was a man trying to lift the next generation. Teaching kids music and discipline. His funeral turned into a rallying cry, with thousands demanding change. But in New Orleans, change was slow, and blood continued to flow. The 2011 Mother's Day Parade, shooting on May 12, 2013. Joy turned to terror when gunmen opened fire on a Mother's Day's second-line parade in the 7th Ward. At least 19 people were wounded in the attack, which police later tied to gang retaliation. Footage showed families scrambling, children screaming, and musicians dropping their instruments as shots rang out. The shooting reminded everyone that, in New Orleans, even celebrations were not safe from violence. The case of Neil Hargrove in 2016. The city was stunned by the murder of Neil Hargrove, a retired firefighter and beloved community activist. Hargrove was shot during an attempted robbery while pumping gas. His death sparked outrage, not just because of his role in the community, but because it underscored the randomness of violence in modern New Orleans. For every gang killing, there were stories like Hargrove's, ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire of a city still wrestling with its demons. The French Quarter remains dangerous even as New Orleans invested billions in rebuilding tourism. The French Quarter remained a hotspot for crime. Muggings, stabbings, and shootings often happened just steps away from Bourbon Street, where tourists packed the bars and clubs. One of the most infamous incidents came in 2014, when a gunfight on Bourbon Street left a 21-year-old nursing student dead. The shooters were aiming at rivals, but the bullet struck her instead. The story made national headlines, once again painting the quarter as a place where joy and danger walked hand in hand. Today, as crime crises of the 2020s, New Orleans still struggles with violence. The city's homicide rate regularly ranks among the highest in the nation. Carjackings, armed robberies, and brazen daylight shootings have surged since the COVID-19 pandemic. Videos of gun battles in broad daylight circulate online, fueling the city's reputation as a place where violence is never far away. Yet, through it all, New Orleans endures. Jazz still pours out of Frenchmen. Street Mardi Gras still rolls every spring, and funerals still dance through the quarter, turning grief into resilience. From voodoo killers like Clementine Barnabet, to mafia bosses like Carlos Marcello, to modern-day gang wars, New Orleans has always carried a reputation for bloodshed. But crime in New Orleans isn't just statistics. It's part of the city's strange alchemy, tragedy mixed with beauty, despair laced with music. It's a place where haunted houses tell stories of torture, where mafia ghosts linger in the quarter, and where jazz funerals turn murders into memory. New Orleans crime stories are not just about violence. They are about survival in a city that refuses to die. Angola, the farm of blood. No discussion of Louisiana crime is complete without Angola Prison, the state penitentiary located upriver from New Orleans. Nicknamed the farm for its massive plantation-like grounds, Angola has long been considered one of America's most brutal prisons. In the 20th century, stories emerged of inmates working 18-hour days in sweltering fields, overseen by guards on horseback with rifles. A haunting echo of slavery. Violence inside was constant. Prison gangs ruled the cell, and stabbings were frequent. The Angola blood bucket, as prisoners called it, symbolized the daily reality of life on the edge of death. The most infamous case was that of the Angola Three: Herman Wallace, Albert Wood, and Robert King, who were accused of killing a guard in 1972. Wallace and Woodfox spent over 40 years in solitary confinement, the longest such term in U.S. history. Their supporters claimed the charges were fabricated to silence their activism in the prison's Black Panther chapter. The Angola saga illustrates how crime in New Orleans does not end with a conviction. It often continues behind bars, where survival becomes a second, darker story. The murder of baby Jane Dewin, 1990. The body of a young girl was discovered in the Desire housing projects. She was never identified, and police nicknamed her Baby Jane Doe. The case was heartbreaking. She had been abused, strangled, and discarded like trash despite years of searching. No family ever came forward, and her killer was never caught. The story haunted detectives, and to this day, her grave remains marked only as Jane Doe in a New Orleans cemetery. The murder became a chilling reminder of the city's unsolved crimes, victims whose stories end without justice. Lost in the noise of a city drowning in violence. Mafia legacy. The Marcello trials. After decades of rule, Carlos Marcello, New Orleans mafia boss, was finally brought to trial in the 1980s on charges of racketeering and conspiracy. Federal prosecutors painted a picture of a man who controlled judges, bribed governors, and even had FBI agents on his payroll. Witnesses described suitcases of cash exchanged in French Quarter backrooms and contracts taken out on rivals. Though Marcello was convicted, appeals and retrials dragged on until his death in 1993. Even after he was gone, whispers of his influence lingered. Older New Orleanians still claim Marcello had a hand in everything from the French Quarter strip clubs to the JFK assassination in New Orleans. The mob was never just crime. It was part of the city's power structure. The Canal Street brothel murders in 2001. Police discovered the bodies of 3 women in a building just off Canal Street. All 3 had been sex workers, strangled and left to rot in what locals whispered was a mob-owned property. The case sparked controversy because of the victims' identities. Poor, marginalized women who worked in the shadows of the French Quarter for months. Police barely investigated, leading activists to accuse them of indifferency. DNA evidence linked the killings to a drifter passing through the city. But the slow investigation highlighted a painful truth. In New Orleans, some lives seem to matter less than others. Corruption in uniform. The Len Davis case, perhaps the most infamous NOPD officer in history, was Len Davis, nicknamed RoboCop by fellow officers for his reputation for brutality. In 1994, Davis orchestrated the murder of Kim Groves, a woman who had filed a police brutality complaint against him using drug dealers as hitmen. Davis had her executed just days after she reported him. The case shocked, even hardened, New Orleans. It wasn't just a dirty cop taking bribes. It was a cop ordering assassinations. Davis was sentenced to death in 1996. A rare outcome for a police officer. His case became a symbol of just how rotten the NOPD had become. In the 1990s, the bloody reign of the Magnolia Projects, the C.J. Pete housing project, better known as the Magnolia, was another epicenter of violence in the 80s and 90s. The Magnolia gave rise to gangs, drug empires, and eventually a cultural wave of bounce and rap music that told the world about life in New Orleans. Deadliest corner shootouts between rival crews were constant. Police described the project as a war zone, where children grew up knowing the sound of automatic gunfire before they could read rappers like Juvenile, Lil Wayne, and the Cash Money Records crew often referenced the Magnolia, cementing its legend in American pop culture. But behind the fame was blood. Families fled in the thousands, leaving behind hollowed-out buildings filled with violence. The case of Zach Bowen and Addie Halper, perhaps the most infamous post-Katrina crime of passion, shocked even hardened locals with its brutality. In 2006, Army veteran Zach Bowen strangled his girlfriend, Addie Hall, inside their French Quarter apartment. After killing her, Bowen dismembered her body, cooking some parts on the stove and storing others in the fridge. He then wrote a chilling confession before leaping to his death from the Omni Royal Orleans hotel rooftop. The case became a symbol of post-Katrina trauma, a city broken not only by crime, but by psychological collapse. Bowen, once hailed as a hero for helping during Katrina, had turned into one of the quarter's darkest monster serial killers of New Orleans. Though not as famous as Bundy or Dahmer, New Orleans has seen its share of serial killers. The Axeman of New Orleans 1918-1919, the jazz-loving murderer who invaded homes and slaughtered families, leaving behind bloody scenes and bizarre letters. Clementine Barnabet, 1911-1912, the so-called voodoo priestess who confessed to dozens of acts. Murders Ronald Dominique, 1997-2006, the Bayou Strangler, who murdered at least 23 men in parishes surrounding New Orleans. Many of them poor or homeless, each left a legacy of fear, adding to the city's reputation as a hunting ground for predators who thrived in the shadows of jazz and chaos folklore of crime in New Orleans. Crime doesn't just fade, it becomes legend. The Axeman's letter to the Times-Picayune in 1919 is still read aloud on ghost tours. The story of Marie Love, the voodoo queen, is entwined with whispers of curses and hexes against enemies. Even modern killings become woven into folklore, with ghost hunters claiming to see spirits of murder victims in the alleys of the quarter. Crime, death, and the supernatural are not separate here. They are stitched together into the very fabric of the city. Reflections. Why New Orleans breeds crime? Why has New Orleans always been a city of crime? Historians and criminologists point to several factors. Geography, a port city, open to smugglers, pirates, and drug routes. Culture, a place where law was always loose, where gambling, drinking, and vice flourished. Poverty, deep inequality created desperate conditions, fueling theft and gang life. Corruption, police, judges, and politicians were often as criminal as the men they prosecuted. Chaos, from hurricanes to fires. Disaster often weakened law and gave opportunity to predators. The result, a city where crime is not just an occasional eruption, it's a constant drumbeat. Though, murder of Officer Darrell Holloway in 2015. Tragedy struck when NOPD officer Darrell Holloway was murdered in the line of duty while transporting a suspect to jail. The man somehow slipped out of his handcuffs, grabbed Holloway's gun, and shot him inside the police car. The killing of Holloway, a respected veteran officer, sent shockwaves through New Orleans. It was a chilling reminder that violence in the city did not discriminate. Not even law enforcement was safe at his funeral. Thousands of officers and citizens gathered, honoring him as a hero. Yet his death also highlighted a deeper problem: how broken systems and desperation fuel reckless, senseless killings. The Gerttown shootout in 2012. The Mother's Day parade shooting had already shaken the city, but a year later, the neighborhood of Gerttown witnessed another eruption of gun violence. Two gangs clashed in the middle of the day, exchanging fire in front of children and families. Dozens of shots rang out, leaving multiple people wounded. What made the Gerttown shootout stand out was not just the violence, it was the brazenness. Gun battles weren't happening in the shadows anymore, they were happening in broad daylight, in front of TV cameras, with shooters showing no fear of police. The murder of Helen Hill in January 2007. Beloved filmmaker Helen Hill was shot to death inside her home in the Bywater neighborhood, just days after the murder of musician Denorel. Shivers, her husband, was shot but survived. Their infant son, asleep in the house, was unharmed. The double tragedies of Shivers and Hill within the same week sparked a massive March for Survival protest, where over 5,000 residents marched on City Hall, demanding justice. Their message was clear: New Orleans couldn't survive if its artists, teachers, and musicians kept being slaughtered. The dark side of Bourbon Street. Tourists love Bourbon Street for its neon lights, open bars, and music, but locals know that Bourbon has always carried a dark shadow. Pickpockets, scammers, and hustlers stalk the crowds. Drug dealers sell openly in the alleys. Fights spill out of strip clubs, sometimes ending in stabbings or shootings. The 2016 Bourbon Street mass shooting, where 10 people were injured and 1 killed, was a turning point. The gunmen weren't even targeting tourists. It was a gang feud that erupted in the middle of a tourist-packed street. Steedy leaders were embarrassed, but New Orleanians weren't surprised. Bourbon Street has always been two things at once: a stage for joy and a hunting ground for predators. Unsolved mysteries. New Orleans is haunted not just by ghosts, but by unsolved murders that still linger in police files. The French Quarter Strangler. 1990s, multiple women, mostly sex workers, were found strangled and dumped. Those suspects were arrested. Many believe the true killer was never caught. The Canal Street Jane Doe 2000s. A woman's body was found near Canal Street. With few clues, her case remains unsolved. One of dozens of cold cases. The disappearance of Albert King 2010s. A local businessman vanished without a trace. Last seen leaving a bar near the quarter. His body has never been found. These stories fuel conspiracy theories, ghost tales, and whispers on Bourbon Street balconies in New Orleans. Unsolved crimes don't fade. They become folklore. Police corruption in the modern era. The NOPD's dark history of corruption didn't end in the 1990s. In the 2010s, multiple officers were caught running protection rackets for drug dealers, falsifying reports, and even tipping off gangs about raids. A federal investigation forced the NOPD into a consent decree, one of the most sweeping reforms in U.S. police history. Body cameras, new training, and stricter oversight were implemented, but even with reforms, many locals still view the police with suspicion. In a city where cops once acted as hitmen, rebuilding trust is a slow process. Social media, and the new face of crime. By the 2020s, New Orleans gangs began using social media as part of their warfare. Instagram and Facebook became tools for taunts, threats, and even confessions. Young gang members filmed themselves flashing guns and stacks of cash, often leading police directly to them, but it also made violence more unpredictable. Online beefs escalated into real-world shootings, with neighborhoods suffering because of a Facebook post. It was a new chapter in New Orleans crime, one where the digital world and the streets collided. The COVID crime surged during the COVID-19 pandemic. New Orleans saw a terrifying spike in violence with schools closed, jobs lost, and police resources stretched thin. Gangs and carjackers thrived. Carjackings nearly doubled between 2020 and 2021, many involving teenagers. One case shocked the nation. In 2022, a 73-year-old grandmother was dragged to her death during a carjacking committed by 4 teenagers. The brutal crime sparked outrage and soul-searching for many. It was proof that the cycle of violence, poverty, broken homes, desperation was swallowing yet another generation. Tourists in the crossfire. Tourism is New Orleans' lifeblood, yet tourists are often the most visible victims of crime. Muggings in the quarter, robberies on Canal Street, and shootings near parades make headlines that scare visitors. The city has tried to strike a balance. Heavy police presence in tourist zones, while violence continues unchecked in poor neighborhoods. But in reality, crime doesn't respect those boundaries. Visitors and locals alike fall victim to the same blood-soaked streets, closing in on the present today. New Orleans faces a paradox. It is one of America's most beloved cultural capitals, and also one of its most dangerous cities. Every year, new cases add to the long, grim history. Families bury their children. Police promise reform, politicians vow change, and yet, the cycle continues. The story of New Orleans crime is not a straight line. It's a loop, repeating across centuries. From the axemen of 1919 to the carjackers of 2022. The city remains locked in a dance with death, crime, and survival. And through it all, the music never stops. The long shadow of political corruption is crime, is the lifeblood of New Orleans. And political corruption is its skeleton, the structure that allows everything else to flourish. From the 1800s to the 2000s, New Orleans politics has been infamous for its mix of backroom deals, kickbacks, and straight-up theft. In the 1930s, Governor Huey P. Long, known as the Kingfish, built a political machine that some called revolutionary. others called criminal while not a New Orleans mayor himself. His influence reached deep into the Crescent City. He mastered patronage, rewarding loyalty with jobs, contracts, and favors. In the 1970s, Mayor Ernest Dutch Morial clashed with police unions, contractors, and crime bosses, often walking the thin line between reform and compromise. In the 2000s, Mayor Ray Nagin became a symbol of post-Katrina corruption, once hailed as a reformer. He was later convicted on 20 of 21 federal corruption charges, including bribery and wire fraud. The lesson: in New Orleans, political leadership has often been entangled with the same forces driving the city's street violence. The New Orleans Mafia, America's first crime family, long before the Gambinos ran New York. New Orleans had the first Italian-American mafia family, the Matronga family, later the Marcello family, dominated the city's underworld for more than a century. In the late 1800s, the Hennessy assassination scandal shook New Orleans. When police chief David Hennessy was gunned down, rumors swirled that Sicilian mafia men were behind it. The resulting trial and lynching of Italian immigrants in 1891 became one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. In the mid-1900s, boss Carlos Marcello ruled New Orleans like a king. His empire stretched from gambling dens to politicians' pockets. He was even suspected of having ties to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, though never proven. Whispers of his involvement remain one of the great conspiracy theories of the 20th century. While the mafia's grip loosened in the late 20th century, its shadow lingers. Organized crime in New Orleans laid the foundation for the city's unique relationship with corruption and violence. The cocaine wars of the 198 OSA's Miami became the cocaine capital of America. New Orleans wasn't far behind. The city's port made it a perfect hub for drug trafficking. Tons of cocaine and marijuana passed through its docks, often with the quiet cooperation of dock workers, union men, and crooked officials. By the mid-1980s, crack cocaine devastated poor neighborhoods. Entire blocks in the 9th Ward in Central City became open-air drug markets. The Hot Boys era of the 1990s, when young rappers like Lil Wayne, Juvenile, and BG came up, reflected the reality of drug-fueled violence in their neighborhoods. Police struggled to contain it, especially since many officers were themselves profiting from the trade. The cocaine boom left scars that are still visible today. Fatherless homes, neighborhoods stripped of stability, and a generation lost to addiction or prison. Katrina and the criminal exodus. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 didn't just flood homes, it reshaped the criminal underworld. When the levees broke, entire neighborhoods were destroyed, police stations were abandoned, prisons flooded, and some inmates escaped into the chaos. Looting wasn't just survival, it was opportunity. Guns, jewelry, and cash were taken en masse. Gangs regrouped in shelters, often continuing their feuds inside the Superdome itself. But Katrina also scattered New Orleans criminals across the U.S. Cities like Houston, Atlanta, and Dallas suddenly saw an influx of New Orleans gangs, spreading the city's unique brand of violence elsewhere. When residents returned, turf lines had shifted, old crews fought over new corners, sparking some of the bloodiest years in recent memory. The tragedy of innocence. For every gangster killed in a feud, there is a story of an innocent victim, the kind of loss that reminds everyone how random and cruel New Orleans violence can be. It. Murder of Denarel Shivers, 2006, a teacher and musician, shot because of a feud involving his teenage stepson. His death sparked citywide protests. The death of Helen Hill, 2007, a filmmaker and activist, killed in her own home. Her murder remains one of the most senseless crimes in post-Katrina. On Olathe, carjacking of Linda Fricky, 2022, a grandmother dragged to death by teenagers, horrifying the entire city. These stories cut deeper than gang killings. They remind New Orleans that crime isn't contained. It bleeds into families, schools, and the very soul of the city. The psychological cycle of violence. Why does New Orleans remain America's murder capital? Experts point to a combination of factors. Poverty. New Orleans consistently ranks among the poorest major U.S. cities. Distrust of authority. Decades of corrupt policing mean many residents don't trust the justice system. Culture of retaliation. In many neighborhoods, calling the police is considered betrayal. Justice is sought through personal revenge. Generational trauma. Children grow up seeing violence as normal, inheriting cycles of anger and fear. One criminologist put it this way: in New Orleans, murder is not just crime, it is culture. The modern-day battlefield. As of the 2020s, the face of New Orleans crime has shifted yet again. Carjackings, often by teenagers, using stolen cars to commit further robberies. Mass shootings, feuds spilling out in public, sometimes during parades or festivals. Social media warfare. Young gang members post videos taunting rivals, escalating tensions. And yet, amid the chaos, the city still breathes with life. Tourists still dance to jazz on Frenchman Street. Families still gather for Sunday gumbo. Brass bands still march through the quarter. This is the paradox of New Orleans, a place of joy built on pain, a city of music echoing over the sound of gunfire. The gangs of New Orleans. To understand modern crime in the Crescent City, you have to know its gangs. Unlike cities like Chicago or Los Angeles, New Orleans gangs aren't massive, long-running organizations. They're small, neighborhood-based cliques, sometimes just a few blocks wide, but their rivalries are no less deadly. The 3NG, 3rd, and Galvez, based in Central City. 3NG became one of the most notorious gangs of the 2000s, known for brazen shootings. They were eventually targeted by federal RICO indictments. Dozens of members were taken down, but their name still carries weight. The G-Strip ghost town, operating out of the 9th Ward, G-Strip developed a reputation for extreme violence. They were heavily involved in drug trafficking and responsible for multiple murders. The Bird Gangan, another Central City outfit, infamous for their feud with rival cliques. Members often used rap videos to taunt opponents, blending music and murder. The Cutoff Boys and Brick Boys from Algiers. These crews clashed over turf, leading to multiple homicides. Some of their battles were so relentless that entire housing complexes felt like war zones. Gang culture of New Orleans is unique. Instead of major super gangs, it's a patchwork of small, violent groups, but the result is the same. Generations of young men lost to prison or the graveyard. New Orleans Parish Prison, the House of Horror. The streets are deadly. Orleans Parish Prison (OPP) is worse known nationally as one of the most violent and mismanaged jails in America. OPP has been described as a death trap by civil rights groups during Hurricane Katrina. The jail famously abandoned hundreds of inmates. Prisoners were left locked in cells as floodwaters rose, some surviving only by breaking through walls or climbing to higher levels. Guards were accused of beating prisoners, smuggling drugs, and even running fight clubs. Overcrowding, poor medical care, and rampant violence made OPP a symbol of everything broken in New Orleans. Justice system. On former inmate said, "You walk in OPP, you don't know if you're walking out alive. It's a jungle." The Danziger Bridge shootings, one of the darkest chapters in NOLA crime history, came not from gangs, but from the police after Hurricane Katrina. In September 2005, NOPD officers opened fire on unarmed civilians crossing the Danziger Bridge. 2 people were killed. 4 were wounded. The victims weren't looters or armed suspects. They were families trying to survive. One of the dead was a mentally disabled man, shot in the back. The cover-up was almost as shocking as the crime. Officers planted weapons and falsified reports. Years later, multiple officers were convicted in federal court. It was a stain on the NOPD that reinforced a painful truth. In New Orleans, the people couldn't always trust those sworn to protect them. The Henry Glover case. Another post-Katrina atrocity involved Henry Glover, a man shot by police outside a strip mall. Instead of helping him, officers beat those who tried to assist, and later burned Glover's body in a car to destroy evidence. Brutality stunned the nation when details emerged for New. It was further proof that the storm hadn't just flooded homes, it had unleashed a darkness in the city's police force. Serial killers in the Crescent City, New Orleans doesn't just deal with gang shootings, it's also been stalked by serial killers. The Axeman 19181919, already legendary. The jazz-obsessed killer remains one of America's most famous unsolved cases. Clementine Barnabet, 1910s. A teenage girl allegedly linked to a series of axe murders across Louisiana, including New Orleans. She confessed, but later recanted. Historians still debate her guilt. The Baton Rouge serial killer, 2000s, though mostly active in Baton Rouge. Derek Todd Lee's killing spree spread fear into New Orleans suburbs as well. The French Quarter Blue Roof Killer, 1990s. A man who targeted women in the quarter, preying on those leaving bars late at night. These figures are less remembered than the daily shootings, but they form part of the city's darker folklore. Global comparison. A murder capital, New Orleans has often been labeled the murder capital of America, but how does it compare globally? In 1994, New Orleans' murder rate peaked at 85 per 100,000 residents, higher than many war zones by comparison. New York that year was around 25 per 100,000, and London was under 5 even today. NOLA's murder rate rivals cities like Caracas, Venezuela, and Cape Town. South Africa is a grim badge of dishonor, but unlike cartel-run cities, New Orleans' violence comes not from billion-dollar drug empires, but from poverty, gangs, and systemic neglect. Community resistance. For every headline about murder, there's a quieter story of resistance. Silences Violence, 2007. A movement born after the deaths of Dinero Shivers and Helen Hill. Musicians marched, demanding peace. Mother's Day protests, 2013. After the parade shooting, thousands again rallied for reform. Grassroots programs, mentorship groups, church-led initiatives, and neighborhood watches all fight to break cycles of violence. Yet, many of these movements struggle because of lack of funding and support. In a city where music and joy are abundant, resources for saving young lives are scarce. Why? The world still loves New Orleans, despite the blood, despite the headlines. Tourists keep coming, jazz still plays on Frenchmen Street, Mardi Gras still draws millions. Why? Because New Orleans is bigger than its crime. It is a city of paradoxes. Joy next to sorrow, music next to gunfire, parades marching past crime scenes. The people of New Orleans live with danger, but they also live with passion, and that, more than anything, explains why the city endures housing projects as war zones. Few places shape the story of New Orleans crime like its massive housing projects. The Magnolia CJP housing development. Magnolia was infamous for its size and violence. In the 1980s, 90s, it became a hub for the crack trade. The uptown crews fought for dominance, and shootouts were routine. Out of this environment came Cash Money Records, with rappers like Juvenile and Soulja Slim, voices that reflected the streets they came from. The Calliope, B.W. Cooper, home to Master P, and the No Limit Empire. Calliope was another war zone during the crack era. Police raids, gang wars, and federal indictments tore through its blocks. But for many, the music industry became a ticket out. The Desire Projects, once the largest housing project in the U.S. Desire was a battleground for decades. In the 1970s, the Black Panthers briefly took over, clashing with police in dramatic standoffs. By the 1990s, it was run by gangs, its name synonymous with danger. These projects were more than just homes. They were crime incubators, shaped by poverty, neglect, and government abandonment. New Orleans rap exploded in the 1990s, 2000s, but success often came with blood. Soulja Slim, beloved for his raw storytelling, was gunned down in 2003 outside his mother's house. Many saw it as a symbol of how hard it was to escape the streets. No matter how high you climbed, members of Cash Money Records and No Limit often rapped about real crews, real corners, and real violence. Sometimes those beefs spilled into actual shootings. Young rappers today continue the tradition, recording drill-style diss tracks, mocking rivals, and escalating real-world feuds. Music became both an escape and a weapon. It gave young men a voice, but it also magnified the cycle of revenge crimes. Against tourist tourism is New Orleans' heartbeat and its greatest vulnerability over the years. Several crimes against visitors shocked the world. The French Quarter robberies in the 1990s and 2000s. Muggings of tourists grew so common that travel advisories warned about Bourbon Street at night. The 2016 Bourbon Street shooting, a feud between two men, escalated into gunfire in the middle of a tourist-packed street. 10 were shot. 1 killed. The chaos was caught on cell phones and broadcast globally. The 2018 armed robberies. Several groups of tourists were targeted by teenagers with guns, leading to outrage that the city is eating its own golden goose every time a tourist is killed. Headlines scream louder, but locals know the truth. What tourists see once. Residents live with daily crooked cops, a dark tradition. The NOPD has a long history of corruption, but certain cases stand out as particularly notorious. Len Davis, 1990s, the death squad cop who ordered the murder of a woman after she filed a brutality complaint against him. He's still on federal death. Roe Antoinette, Frank, 1995. An officer who robbed a restaurant she worked security for, murdering 2 employees and her own fellow officer. Her betrayal shook the city. Post-Katrina cover-ups, from Danziger Bridge to Henry Glover. The police were caught in outright murder and leaving scars that still haven't healed for many in New Orleans. The line between cop and criminal has often blurred. The juvenile dilemma. One of the city's most painful issues is the rise of juvenile crime. Carjackings, robberies, and even murders are increasingly committed by kids as young as 13 or 14. In one infamous 2022 case, 14s were arrested for the brutal carjacking that killed grandmother Linda. Freaky. Why? So many kids. Poverty and broken families leave them vulnerable. Schools are underfunded, and often unsafe. Gangs recruit from middle schools, offering status and quick money. The justice system struggles. Should a 14-year-old murderer be treated as a child or as a hardened criminal? In New Orleans, that question keeps coming up. Redemption stories. Not every story ends in prison or death. Some break free from the cycle. Former gang members now run community mentorship programs, teaching kids alternatives to crime. Rappers turned activists speak at schools, warning about the streets. Churches and nonprofits create safe spaces in neighborhoods. Still scarred by shootings, one powerful example is a former Magnolia gang member who served 15 years for armed robbery. Today, he runs a program teaching job skills to teens, saying, "If I can keep just one kid from picking up a gun, I've done my part." These stories rarely make national news, but they matter. They are the city's hope. Then, never-ending loop. Looking back across more than a century of crime, one truth is clear. New Orleans doesn't escape violence. It survives it. The mafia, the axemen, corrupt cops, Katrina, gangs, carjackings. Each era has its monsters, and yet, the music still plays. Second lines still march. Mardi Gras still comes. Crime defines part of New Orleans, but it doesn't define all of it. The city is tragedy and joy bound together. A place where jazz horns wail above the sound of gunfire, and where every new generation must decide whether to break the cycle or be swallowed by it. The great heists of New Orleans. New Orleans is not just about shootings. It has a rich history of daring robberies and schemes. The Canal Street bank robbery, 1920s. A gang of armed men stormed a downtown bank in broad daylight. Making off with thousands in cash, they vanished into the French Quarter. Never caught. Some say the mafia protected them. The dock heists, 1950s, 70s, with the port being one of America's busiest. Smuggling was rampant. Crates of liquor, electronics, and even cars disappeared. Longshoremen often worked hand in hand with mobsters. The casino skims, 1990s. When legal gambling came to New Orleans, Crime followed, cheating rings, dealer collusions, and organized skimming operations targeted the casinos. These heists showed another side of Crescent City crime, one less about blood, more about brains. Mardi Gras, masked joy, hidden crimes. Mardi Gras is the city's pride, but also its most vulnerable time with millions in the streets. Crime thrives, pickpockets and hustlers. For decades, police have struggled to contain organized pickpocket rings working the parade's tourists. Drunk and distracted are easy prey. Violence after parades. Many murders have happened in the shadow of Mardi Gras. Feuds erupt at night after the float's roll. Mask of anonymity. Mardi Gras masks have historically made it easier for criminals to blend in, commit robberies, and vanish into the crowd. And, in the 1800s, newspapers warned, "Beware the carnival thief, he loves Mardi Gras more than anyone." Voodoo, cults, and ritual crimes. New Orleans is famous for its voodoo heritage, but it has also been linked to bizarre, ritualistic crimes. The voodoo murders. 1900s. Police reported several cases of killings tied to supposed rituals, often in poor neighborhoods where African spiritual practices were misunderstood and criminalized. The Cult of the Cross. 1970s. A fringe religious group operating in the outskirts of New Orleans was accused of abusing children and practicing strange rites there. Leader was eventually convicted of fraud and assault. Modern satanic panic. 1980s, 90s. Like much of the U.S., New Orleans saw accusations of satanic cults sacrificing animals in cemeteries. Most were exaggerated, but some real cases of grave desecration shocked locals. These crimes were often sensationalized, blending the city's mystical reputation with real violence. Angola, the farm of blood. No story of Louisiana crime is complete without Angola Prison, the state penitentiary, known as the farm, located north of New Orleans. Angola is infamous as one of the harshest prisons in America, built on a former slave plantation. It holds thousands of inmates, many serving life without parole. Violence is rampant. Stabbings, rapes, and gang wars inside Angola once hosted the Angola Rodeo, where inmates rode bulls for entertainment, a bizarre mix of punishment and spectacle. Notorious criminals from New Orleans, from hitmen to gang leaders, often end up in Angola, never to leave. Local legends of crime. Some criminals in New Orleans have become twisted folk heroes. Mac the Knife. 1960s. A stick-up man who robbed French Quarter bars and was rumored to charm women even as he pulled a gun. The French Quarter Phantom. 1980s. A burglar who specialized in breaking into quarter mansions, leaving mocking notes. Never caught. Telly Hankton. 2000s. A drug kingpin from Central City, considered one of the most dangerous men in Louisiana, convicted for multiple murders. He ran an empire that terrified even other gangsters. These figures are whispered about in barrooms and second-line parades, woven into the city's folklore. Hollywood and the crime image. New Orleans crime has long fascinated filmmakers and writers. A Streetcar named Desire showed the raw passion and danger of the French Quarter. The Big, Easy One. 986 depicted a city where cops and criminals danced to close. True crime documentaries. Countless shows like The First 48 have filmed in NOLA, highlighting its sky-high murder rate. The world sees New Orleans crime as both tragic and romantic, a city of shadows, jazz, and blood. The National, shame and pride. Every time the murder rate spikes, New Orleans makes headlines. America's murder capital. Politicians promise reform, but the cycle continues, and yet the people of New Orleans carry it with resilience. They grieve, they bury, they rebuild. Crime is their curse, but also part of their mythos. One local once said, "In New Orleans, you dance with death every day, but you dance." New Orleans has always been a city of contradictions. It is the birthplace of jazz, yet also the graveyard of countless lives lost to violence. It is a place of laughter, music, and parades, yet also of mourning, funerals, and unsolved murders. The stories told here are not just about criminals and crimes, they are about a city that refuses to die. From the mafia's stranglehold on the French Quarter, to the chaos after Katrina, to the modern street gangs that still claim lives, the Crescent City has lived through it, but crime is not the only story of New Orleans. The people, with their resilience, spirit, and culture, have endured. They mourn their dead, but they also second line through the streets with brass bands, turning grief into celebration. They live with danger, but they also live with joy. In the end, New Orleans crime stories are not just about the darkness, they are about survival. They are about a city that, no matter how many times it is scarred, keeps rising, keeps singing, keeps dancing. Because if New Orleans has taught the world anything, it's this: even in the face of violence, the music never stops.